I'd like to start by making a confession. If you're an investor in Helio, you should cover your ears right now, which is that a substantial part of the reason that we started this company was because we love hanging out with really interesting, brilliant writers and talking about the world of ideas and drinking cocktails and having cocktail parties with wonderful people like you. Thank you for unwittingly participating in this master plan of ours. And thank you to the Soho House for co-hosting this series of Cocktails and Questions events. This is the first of a series of monthly gatherings, and we'll tell you a little more about some of the other ones at the end. And thank you, Charles, for being our inaugural special guest.
Thank you for having me. And thank you to all of you for coming out this evening. I really appreciate it.
So though Charles doesn't need an introduction, I'm going to introduce him anyway. Charles Duhigg, as you may know, is a Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist and senior editor who, in his spare time, hosts large and important conferences, advises startups. He's an advisor to Helio. He raises a gaggle of charming children, I'm sure, attentively and expertly. And he writes heavily reported best-selling books, the first of which was The Power of Habit, that came out in 2012, spent 60-plus weeks on the bestseller list, a wonderful book. And now he has given us Smarter, Faster, Better, The Secrets of Being Productive in Life and Business. If anyone needs this book, Charles, it's you, having with this extraordinary set of obligations you have. And actually, I'd love to dive into like the personal side of your journey with the book, which is so interesting. But before I do, I want to very briefly say a few words. For those of you who don't know much about Helio, our mission at Helio is to help great thinkers reach and engage with, connect with audiences in new and powerful ways in order to elevate transformative ideas or ideas that we think are important. So this kind of genre and this type of Charles's work and the work of other great writers is of great personal interest to us at Helio. And I want to start with kind of a kind of big 1,000-foot view, sort of question, which is the genre that some people would refer to as self-help, the self-help genre, right? You can imagine, someone writing a book with the title "Smarter, Faster, Better," maybe skinnier, cuter, with the subtitle, Americans' Obsession with Self-Improvement. So how do we feel about, is this obsession with self-improvement fully a good thing? How do we think about kind of the genre and how it's evolved over time?
I think that's a great question. And let me apologize in advance. I'm starting to lose my voice, so if I sound like I'm like Kathleen Hepburn, then just assume it's because I've been smoking for the last 12 years and want to be really sexy on stage. So I think that's a great question, and I think, and let me ask, because it would be great for this to be a conversation. How many of you would say that you're the types of people who read self-help books? Okay, so a number of us, and how many people in here have read a book by Malcolm Gladwell or Stephen Johnson, who's back there, or Adam Grant or Susan Cain? Right, these are fantastic books, and it's interesting because we're starting to see this backlash against among the sort of literary sets. Particularly, there was a piece by Louis Menand in The New Yorker that was kind of taking these books, and mine in particular, to task, and saying, do we really need this, right? Do we really need these kinds of books? And what I would argue is that we actually do, and we do for two reasons. Not because of this this prurient need for self-improvement, but because we're actually living through a time when two important things are happening. The first is we're living through this period of economic and social change, which most economists at this point agree is going to be as profound as the agrarian revolution and the industrial revolution in terms of changing our lives. Like if you think about, say, 1980 or 1982, when you went home, you would have had a completely different experience as a professional who's our age. Maybe you would have brought home a briefcase with some papers in it. Maybe there'd be some work you could do. But there's no way for you to really connect with your colleagues. There's no email. There's no internet. Information was scarce, and we defined people by the scarcity of information. And now we're living through an age where we actually have a surplus of information, a post-scarcity age. And when you read about the Industrial Revolution, when you read diaries from that period, it looks so romantic and so interesting in retrospect and so exciting. And what people wrote during the time was how anxious and uncertain they were. Because the very definition of what it meant to be productive or what it meant to be successful was changing under people's feet. And that's happening right now, right? We're living through this period that people will look back on and say, this was a pivot in human history, and that is anxiety producing. But at the same time, something else kind of amazing is happening, which is that there's been this explosion in not only understanding how our brain works and having tools to understand organizational psychology and individual psychology, but also this explosion in metaphors. And in many ways, the last time this happened was when Darwin published Origin of the Species, and he introduced this concept of survival of the fittest. And this huge debate that ended up taking the next 40 years over what that actually meant, what values we should assign to the idea of evolution. We are seeing a debate right now that's happening, and hopefully less traumatically, around what we are learning about determinism from the brain, that we actually understand how the brain works in ways that we never even thought were possible before, and these metaphors that are emerging. These metaphors of networked societies, how we create and actually preserve wealth. So for the first time, we have tools to actually understand this changing society around us. And that creates a huge amount of excitement, but also some anxiety. And I think these books are an attempt to say, it's going to be okay, but it's going to be okay because we understand our way out of it, not because we close our eyes to how the world is changing.
And from my perspective, it seems to me that this feels like a bit of a golden age when you think of all the explosion of discoveries and analysis in behavioral economics, and you think of how the power of this great lens of science that we for centuries were focused on the heavens and then the petri dishes and the small things, and now in more recent decades there's more of a focus on applying the scientific method to understanding our own human fulfillment, human effectiveness, our own lives. It strikes me as despite sort of objections from some of the literati, a very good application of science that's pretty relevant to all of us.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think there's a huge pressure to make your research impactful now, right? In a way, it's interesting because you see the series of books coming out from actual professionals. Adam Grant, Angela Duckworth has a book coming out. And if you think back to when Gladwell published The Tipping Point, it seems so fresh and new because the capacity of someone to take research and actually explain it in narrative form, essentially, like, academics didn't know how to do that. And now academics are starting to say, no, actually, we should be the ones doing this. It shouldn't be journalists who are allowed to do it. And what's interesting, though, is that that's a reflection of the fact that because we're living through this age of kind of anxiety and opportunity, that academics are being pushed increasingly to actually come up with ideas that have application in the real world, which is not dissimilar to what happened in biological sciences about 30 or 40 years ago and led to the explosion in new pharmaceuticals that essentially changed medicine and changed our understanding of genetics. And we're now at the tail end of it, where we don't see a lot of new world-changing drugs, because these things do move in waves.
Well, Charles, I'd love to take it back to your wonderful new book, and starting with the personal. I mean, it feels like on some level this was a relatively personal project, and I love the in your wonderful podcast discussion with James Altucher, who's here. There was a great moment when you were describing how here you were, you just won a Pulitzer Prize. Your Power of Habit is a blow-away bestseller. You've just closed on a new book that you're starting to write, and you say to your wife, honey, if this is what success feels like, sign me up for failure.
Yeah, it was terrible, right? Excuse me. it was like the culmination of like so much work and so much like wanting to have the stars align, and then being so lucky to actually have things work. And like I would get home, and we had just had a kid, our second son, and I would have like 150 emails to deal with, and like all these things, all these opportunities that I felt like I had to seize. And all I wanted to do was like drink a glass of wine and watch Breaking Bad and like to fall asleep in front of the TV. And I just thought, like, this is terrible. Like, I cannot imagine, I cannot imagine that this is what the payoff is supposed to be for working so hard. And so at that point, I actually sort of became curious because I saw people around me who it seemed like just had their shit together way more, right? Like they had this ability to like be good parents and to be good spouses and to get important work done and to work in multiple fields. And I thought to myself, like, what are they doing that I can't figure out? And so I started calling researchers and asking them, what are they doing that I can't figure out? And the researchers said, actually, we have studied this, right? There's now 30 or 35 years of understanding high performers and understanding productivity. And we actually know that those people do think differently. They actually are doing something very distinct from everyone else. And what they're doing is they're typically creating systems in their lives, or creating habits, or they're creating what are known as contemplative routines that force them to think half an inch deeper about their priorities and their goals and how they think about managing people. And that half an inch more depth tends to pay off these huge dividends.
You know, I'm really interested to know. I just happily had the focus to read the entirety of your book, which was a complete page turner. But I'm really curious to know. There's so many extraordinary kind of studies and insights and strategies and methodologies, and you know, I'm very curious to know which among them you have found most useful in your own life. And this is a question it's always struck me that, like, if you're talking to a nutrition expert, the question is not what's your prescription for the rest of us. The question is what supplements or what vitamins do you eat, right? And so like among all these prescriptions or methodologies, what have you found, like in the last year or whatever the period is, has most impacted your own productivity, effectiveness, what have you?
So I think that the biggest, most impactful thing for me has been this basic insight that efficiency and productivity are in tension with each other. And that in order to be more productive, you have to force this thinking into your life. And there's this phrase, contemplative routines or contemplative practices. And the problem with this phrase is it sounds very like pastoral, right? Like you should meditate. How many people here meditate on a regular basis? How many people can't stand meditating because it's like so boring? So that's actually fine. So what we know about the most productive people is that they force these contemplative routines into their lives, but the contemplative routines are often very active and they don't look like contemplation. And one of my favorite examples of this is in the book it talks about West Side Story. So there's this basic question, one of the questions, that the book is structured around these eight concepts that the most productive people seem to think differently about. And one of them is innovation. And there's this question, how do people become innovative on demand? How do they speed up the productivity of creativity? So West Side Story is a great studied example of this, where how many people here have seen West Side Story? And we live in New York. How many people here were like performed in West Side Story in your high school? Okay, a number of people. You know Maria, right? So the team behind West Side Story is basically these three guys. And the key idea guy is Jerry Robbins, the choreographer. And for 9 years, they work on this script. And their ambition when they're starting West Side Story is that they want to create something that's wholly new. They want to push avant-garde onto Broadway. And for 9 years, they work on this script, and it's this amazing script. And they actually invent an entirely new language for the characters. They have characters that say things like skip the frabba jabba and cracko jacko, which is actually the first time that in drama that phrase is used. And if you go to the New York Public Library, you can actually see the original script from West Side Story. You have to put on these white gloves, and if they put you in the room, you can take a picture with your iPhone, which I did, as long as you don't tell them. And 3 weeks before the play is supposed to premiere, and they're premiering in Washington, D.C., Jerry Robbins, the choreographer, who's sort of the leader of the team, turns to his colleagues and he says, I just don't think this is working. Like, we're trying to do something new, but we've created this entire vocabulary. It is too new. It's too original. I don't think people are going to understand what we're trying to communicate with them. And so he says, let's take 3 weeks and try and figure out how to fix this. Now, there's these two things that are going on that are kind of interesting at this point. There are a bunch of dime store novels about gangs that have given Americans a vocabulary about gang membership. The same way we all think that we understand the mafia because we've seen the Godfather movies, people think they understand gangs. They know rumbles and gang war councils. And secondarily, Jerry Robbins is this guy who's steeped in classical dance. His background is in ballet. He's staged Swan Lake and the Nutcracker Suite. And what Robbins says is, instead of creating something entirely new, let's take these two vocabularies that people know and let's push them together. Now, has anyone seen West Side Story lately? Okay, so you remember when the curtain raises, imagine for a minute that you're sitting in the theater in 1959. The curtain comes up on West Side Story. And what you see is these characters walk onto stage who are dressed just like the teenagers outside the theater doors. But for the first 9 minutes, they don't say anything. Instead, what they do is they start to dance. But the dance that they have, the choreography, is very unique because it actually echoes everything that you've seen in classical ballet. They start by doing this move that's actually kind of famous from Swan Lake of people interweaving and raising up their arms. And they're all male actors, all the male actors do this thing called a rond de triomphe, which is a way of raising up your leg and showing possession of the stage. And if you were watching this in 1959, you would know exactly what they're doing because you're a theater goer, you're familiar with the vocabulary of ballet, but it's being performed by these people who are dressed in street clothes, and then they almost immediately go into this plot about rape and racial warfare and gangs that you've never seen on a stage before. The reason we know West Side Story is because of this opening, the West Side Story prologue. It sort of transformed everything that came afterwards in musical theater. And what's interesting about it is that it's based on these cliches. It's based on these established vocabularies. That's where the sense of newness comes from, is the juxtaposition of these old ideas in new ways. And so then the question becomes, and this is an answer of how this has changed my life, is why did Jerry Robbins know to do this? Because we've all been to bad art shows, right, where someone takes two ideas and they jam them together. How did he know that these ideas belong together? Well, the interesting thing about Jerry Robbins is he's what's known in the academic literature as an innovation broker. He had these incredibly wide-ranging tastes. He would he read Romeo and Juliet and he loved these dime store novels, and he knew ballet, but he would also go to like these jitterbug contests that they had all over New York, and none of his friends from the ballet world would come with him. They all looked down their nose at the jitterbug contests. He was, among his friends, openly bisexual at a time when homosexuality was illegal. He would go to all these meetings of communists, and he literally did not understand what communists were, but he just liked to watch people argue with each other, and basically if you take a room full of communists, they'll just fight all night long and then go have sex, and he thought that was awesome. And now what's interesting is what he did afterwards. So Jerry Robbins would come home from the jitterbug contest or from these meetings of the Communist Party, and he would sit down and he would write these incredibly long letters, like 30 or 40-page letters, so long that when he mailed them to friends, they would write things back like, I read the first 6 pages of your letter and I threw the rest away, but here's my responses. And the reason he would write these is because he wasn't writing them for other people. He was forcing himself to think about what he had just seen. He was forcing himself to take these ideas and try and push them together. That was his contemplative routine, was that he wrote letters. And it was hard and boring. We've all written letters. We know that it's not an easy thing to do. But he forced this thinking into his life. And that's the biggest thing that I take away, is that productive people are people who force themselves to think more. They force themselves to engage in what Anders Ericsson, the guy who wrote Peak and sort of has studied high performance, calls this deliberate practice, where we do things that are a little bit hard and uncomfortable, but force us to think. That is the thing that I've carried away. And it's changed how I write my to-do list. It's changed how I spend my time on the subway. It's changed everything because I now recognize that the killer app is forcing yourself to think more than everyone else around you.
You know, I remember my 10th grade English teacher said something that I still remember to this day. I've forgotten everything else he said, which was, great writing is using ordinary words in unusual ways. Apparently I was using unusual words in not so innovative ways. But it always stuck with me, and that the innovation chapter is fascinating because you have, in this great kind of way that you tend to approach this, which some would describe as this great kind of Gladwellian era of the combination of compelling stories and then science, right? There's a fair amount of science to back up that the most innovative science papers take reference, other ideas that are very common ideas, but in new ways, right? So
that's exactly right. That's it. And since Stephen is in the room, we shouldn't be talking about innovation since he wrote a whole book about it. But that's exactly right. That there is this guy named Brian Uzi. He looked at 18 million science papers to try and figure out. He wanted to get tenure himself, and so he thought an interesting project would be to see who writes papers that get them tenure. And so he looked at these 18 million papers, and he came up with an algorithm to judge which were the most innovative and which were the most influential. And what he found, his hypothesis going in is that if a paper contains 65% new information, that people would love it. And it turns out if you write a paper with 65% new information, 12 people will read it during your lifetime. So then he goes to 50% and 40%, and the numbers don't improve until he gets to 10% new information. 10% new information and 90% ideas that have been picked over by scientists for years, that's when suddenly a paper can explode. And it has to be a good paper. Not every paper works, but that's the magic ratio. For exactly this reason, is that something that's too new, there's no purchase. We don't pay attention to it. But something that takes these ideas that we think we know and puts them in some context that we haven't seen before, that's when all of a sudden you think to yourself, oh, that's kind of interesting.
And I was thinking about how as I was reading the book and getting sucked into all these different stories, and then reading the data and the science to back it up so that my skeptical science side of my brain was sort of satisfied. It struck me as that this combination is not unlike we had an outbreak of strep in our family that went around about 3 times. Everybody got strep 2 or 3 times. And
it sounds like a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was fantastic. And of course, our kids love it because they get to take this amoxicillin that is heavily coated with bubblegum flavored sugar. And I thought, and at some point, as I was flying through the chapters, I thought the stories is the bubblegum syrup, and the amoxicillin is the data, and I'm just voraciously consuming it. So as the writer, right? I mean, do you systematically think about how to combine story and science to deliver?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that's. So I went to business school and was going to go into politics in New Mexico, which is where I grew up. And midway through business school, I went back to Albuquerque, and I spent the summer doing private equity in Albuquerque. And does anyone here do private equity? Okay, you've all, well, except for one guy, you've all made really wise choices. You've made a very profitable choice. So I'd sit down, and my entire job was to build these spreadsheets. And at 11 o'clock, I'd allow myself to listen to This American Life, and I would play an episode of This American Life. And then, if I was feeling really bad about myself, I'd let myself listen to another episode of This American Life. And at the end of the summer, I was trying to figure out what the hell to do with the rest of my life. And I realized the only question that actually seemed sustainably interesting to me was how to tell stories that people would be desperate to finish. Because I think you're exactly right. It's not only the bubblegum, it's actually the ether that we all live in, right? If I want to understand any of you, I'm going to ask you to tell me a story about yourself. And that story is not going to be true. You are going to find elements of that story that I would not tell if I was telling your life story. But stories are the only way that we actually can take ideas and remember them. It's the only sticky matter that lets us actually communicate. And so, yeah, It's the bubble gum.
So getting to some brass tacks, because this I found, this is the thing that I have most applied to my life since reading the book, which is to-do lists. Apparently, I was doing it entirely wrong. The way I was doing to-do lists in the morning is the first thing I do is I'd write down the last 3 things I did. Brush my teeth, floss, kiss my wife. 3 checks, you
feel really good.
Bought some random stuff on Amazon. I'm like, I'm flying here today. I've got 4 checks, I'm cruising, and then write a bunch of other stuff I have to get done. And apparently, I was quite shocked to read that that's actually not the way you're supposed to write a to-do list.
I'm glad. For someone to share productive, I'm glad that was shocking. So this is an example of a contemplative routine that was kind of surprising to me. Similarly, so who here writes to-do lists? Everyone, okay. So a to-do list is a great device for externalizing our memory, right? Most of us write to-do lists the same way. We write down all the junk we want to get done, and then at the bottom of the page, we put something like lose 30 pounds and run a marathon, right? Because we don't want to just think that we're going to buy random crap on Amazon. We're more cultured than that. And when I was talking to this one psychologist who studies to-do lists, he was like, look, that's a fine way to keep track of what you need to get done. But people who do that are using a to-do list for mood repair, not for productivity. You're writing a to-do list to make yourself feel good as you check things off, or to compensate the fact that in high school you probably smoked too much pot and you can't remember what you're supposed to do today. He said what the most productive people do is that they recognize that a to-do list is a contemplation device for prioritization. But only if you push yourself to make it into a device to force you to think about your priorities. And the way that you do that is that at the top of the page, at the top of the to-do list, you write your stretch goal, right? What is the biggest aspiration you want to get done this week or this month? And when it's at the top of your page, it's constantly reminding you, this is actually what you want to get done. Because even the smartest people, right, all of us, by definition of the fact that we are productive, we are also busy. And when you're busy, you stop thinking. You start just reacting, right? Particularly now, you react to your phone buzzing, the 150 emails you've gotten, a colleague coming in and asking for help. It is so much easier to react. In fact, our brains are programmed to react. Evolutionarily, if you were someone who could multitask, you had a huge advantage over everyone else because you could plant crops and look for predators at the same time while your neighbor could only do one or the other and they got eaten or starved to death. And again, you're killing it. So what do the most productive people do? They write this stretch goal at the top of their page. And what's interesting is they don't just do it once. Every day or multiple times a day, they sit down and they say, what is my top priority? Am I certain that what I wrote this morning is still my top priority? Should I change my mind? But more importantly, is what I am doing right now, does it line up with my top priority? Is it something that pushes me to do my highest aspiration? So instead of being simply a list of tasks, it's something that constantly challenges you and forces you to think, am I actually doing the right thing at this very second? Now, what's interesting, though, is that studies show if you just write your stretch goal on a piece of paper, that is actually counterproductive because you'll be overwhelmed, right? If I write run a marathon on my thing or lose 30 pounds, I'm not really certain how to start today. And so this is the other thing that productive people tend to do, is they tend to have a system for breaking goals into specific plans. A system that tends to have a little bit of tension in it. And the one in the book that gets cited frequently, because this is what companies tend to use, are called SMART goals or SMART plans, right? So you say, what do I want to get done this week, and what am I going to do first thing? Let me figure out specifically what I need to do and how I'm going to measure it. And is this achievable? It spells SMART. And if it's achievable, what do I need to do to make it realistic? Do I need to turn off email in the mornings? Do I need to tell my colleagues not to come bother me? What's the timeline for getting the first step of this done? Now, if you talk to people who are unusually productive, what you'll find is they have this heuristic, these cognitive things that they return to, which they tend to do almost automatically at this point. They tend to write down specifically what they want to do, how they're going to measure it. Is it achievable? What do I need to do to make it realistic? It's a habit. But as a result, you have these to-do lists that are, first of all, at the top of the page, constantly reminding you what your top priority is. And then secondly, has this very specific way of forcing you to visualize what you actually want to get done this morning. And once you have that, pretty much like you're unstoppable. And so I do this actually every day, every morning. It takes like 4 minutes. And then at 1 o'clock, right after I come back from lunch, I look at the stretch goal and I try to figure out, like, is what I'm doing right now, does it actually line up with my top priority? And if it doesn't, I stop doing it. And what's crazy is that 80% of the time what I'm doing does not line up with my top priority. Right? It's probably going to be true for you as well. We become overwhelmed by the minutiae of life, but productive people find ways to force themselves to think about the choice that they're making at that moment.
And on the subject of being overwhelmed, one of the most interesting things I've heard you say is related to the etiquette around email, and that email, even though we've all been emailing for like 20 plus years, right, that still it's pretty early in the evolution of email as a communication tool, and we still have not yet evolved a kind of the right kinds of habits and etiquette to use it in a way that's actually functional.
I think that's exactly right. How many people, if I was to look at your phone right now, would have like over 50 emails that you need to? It's surprisingly few of you. You're like very productive people. You're all zero inbox. So I have 114. I checked before I came in. So what's interesting is that if you look at historically how long it takes technological shifts to develop, to become actually genuinely productive and not overwhelming, it's usually a 30 to 35 year period. And this seems pretty consistent. So when telephones were first invented and became sort of widespread in use, there were all these articles that appeared about people complaining that they would get phone calls all the time. And remember, we had party lines back then. So what would happen is that people would actually just pick up the phone and just sit there like all day with the phone on, and they would be like, Jim, are you on there? And like, Jim, can you tell me, like, I'm looking for this one document, like, where is it? Or, you know, have you seen this funny cat piece of paper that I just drew? Because there's no cat videos at that point. But there's these constant complaints about how people use telephones, that they're so intrusive. And then essentially the generation that grew up with telephones uses them completely differently. They stop calling each other unless it's actually important. The same thing is going to happen with email. The same thing's already happening right now. Is that if you think about how we use email, we just inundate each other. There's no etiquette that's been born out of it. But if I talk to teenagers about, they don't use email that way, right? They very infrequently email each other. In fact, they've fallen into a technology and an etiquette of texting that allows them to basically send things that people can ignore very, very easily. And what's interesting to me, though, is that it's not just learning how to use the technology. It's also that our brains tend to adapt to what's around us. So in the early 1900s, there was a law passed in New York City that made it illegal to speak while crossing the street. And the reason why was because legislators were very worried that people would be distracted in their conversations and would not be able to see these fast-moving cars, and they would get killed by the cars. And what's crazy is they were exactly right. People were getting killed by cars all the time because they didn't know how to have conversations and be aware of the vehicles around them at the same time. Now, how many of you have felt like you can't talk and cross the street at the same time, right? A couple of people, okay. So we'll talk about your problems afterwards, but most of us have like mastered this skill of talking and looking for cars at the same time. But that's actually an acquired skill. Our brains tend to evolve in response to the technologies that are around us. We tend to learn new ways to multitask. And that's exactly what's going to happen with forms of communication. Most of us are from a generation that is bridging from one world into another. And we're like racing to catch up. But our kids are going to be able to master this stuff much more easily than we are. They're not going to be distracted by doing 5 things at once in the same way we were, as long as they were 5 things that they all grew up learning how to do.
One of the best pieces of news I've heard all year was from Adam Grant in his new book that, as it turns out, if you're a pathological procrastinator, which I may be a little bit of. That apparently that's a sign that you're a creative genius. This is a great creative advantage. I'm absolutely thrilled about this information. But it seems to me like, well, by the time I got to the end of the book, that I was trying to look at all these different methodologies and hacks and effective strategies, and it seemed to me that a portion of them fall into this category of ways of being looser. That it turned out that that in these examples of procrastination, that the process of being more circuitous and getting to things enables you to make more creative connections and end up with a better product. And so this also came up in around meetings and these Google studies about meetings, that having a more unstructured, informal process and where people felt emotionally safe resulted in better kind of problem solving. So I felt a little bit of a tension between those, the kind of looser, more freewheeling results in more creativity. And on the other hand, if you're more methodical, goal-oriented, take a scientific approach to your life, that you can be far more productive. And I wondered whether there is, and I find this in my own life, that sometimes there's a utility in toggling between a highly productive, goal-oriented, scientific mindset, and then retaining space to play and free associate and make those creative connections that enable you to problem solve effectively. Do you see it that way, or how do you think about it?
So I think that's exactly right. I think that there is, so I think inherent in this idea of how do we push ourselves to think more is tension, right? So what's interesting is, like, you talk about procrastination. My guess is, if I was looking at your life, because you're a fairly productive guy, we're all productive in this room and successful, is that the things that you said that you're procrastinating on would not look to anyone else like genuine procrastination. My guess is you're not like playing like Minecraft on the computer instead of like, writing the pitch deck that you're supposed to do. Or maybe you are. Minesweeper?
I am.
Are you in Minecraft? So what's interesting is that the things that you call procrastination might actually be just yourself creating tension, right? Because you've learned that a certain amount of tension causes you stress. It causes you to think in ways that you don't otherwise do so, right? Like when Adam talks about forcing himself, he wrote a chapter and he put it about procrastination and the virtues of it, and he put it aside. He forced himself to put it aside. And then when he came back to it, he found that he had all these new ideas. And part of that is because he had time for sort of cognitive deliberation, slow and deep. But part of it also is because he kept on getting more and more anxious about writing this chapter, and he kept on thinking, like, I got to come up with some way to end this chapter. And being anxious that way, it forces us to think. It forces us to think in different ways. And what's interesting about this is that if you think about how you structure your own life, you probably do things to try and create tension. One of my favorite examples is in the book we tell the story of this plane called Qantas Flight 32. There's a story of Air France Flight 447 that crashed into the ocean, essentially because the pilots just lost control of their attention. And it's contrasted with the story of Qantas Flight 32. And Qantas Flight 32 is this plane that took off in 2010 from Singapore. It takes off into the air. About 20 minutes into the flight, there's this sound of thousands of marbles being thrown against the hull of the plane, because what had just happened is that one of the jet engine turbine blades detached from the shaft, and it punched a hole in the wing that was big enough for a man's body to fit through. And it hit another blade, and it exploded into thousands of pieces. And this was like shrapnel moving through a plane wing. So it's the worst mid-air mechanical disaster in modern aviation. Now, the guy who's flying the plane is this guy named Richard Duhigg, and he's actually steeped in this kind of thinking called situational awareness, which is building mental models, that we tell ourselves stories about the world as we experience it. And so it gives our brain a script that helps it distinguish what to pay attention to and what to ignore. And Richard Duhigg basically ends up saying to himself, I need to think of this plane as a Cessna. And by imagining the plane as a Cessna, by giving himself a script, he's able to land the plane. But what's really interesting about Richard Duhigg is that he is the type of guy who who will argue with you about anything. I had 5 phone calls with him, and at the conclusion of every phone call, both of us were screaming and would hang, and like, he's in Australia. I don't have a lot, I don't know why I was screaming at him, but he's just this completely argumentative guy. One of his colleagues actually told me that he once got into a near fist fight with him over the proper ingredients of a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It just seems pretty self-explanatory, but apparently Richard can find something to fight about. So what's interesting about Richard is that this idea of situational awareness, this idea of building these mental models, which proved so useful in landing the plane, he was so into this idea that when they were taking the shuttle from the hotel to the tarmac, he would ask his co-pilots to tell him stories about what they would do in emergencies. Like, what's the first words out of your mouth? Where do your eyes go? Where are you going to put your hands if engine 2 goes out? And that's great, right? We want pilots to do that. But then he would pick fights with them. He would argue with them about what they were going to do with their hands. And what's interesting is this is his contemplative device. He was inherently argumentative because it forced him and the people around him to think more deeply about the stories that they're telling, the stories that they're going to rely on in order to land this plane. Which is all a long way of saying that, like, the eccentricity, we tend to look at these productive people and we look at their eccentricities and we think because they're so successful that they can indulge the eccentricity. They can be an argumentative jerk, or they can be someone who's kind of like quasi-obsessive compulsive, or they can take long baths in the morning, or they do something else weird. And we say, oh, he's rich, so he can afford to do that. But actually the reason that he's rich or she's rich is because they do that. Because they have this device that forces thinking into their life that they indulge in. Which is all one way of saying, like, all of you should indulge in your eccentricities. The thing that drives your wife crazy or your husband crazy or the things your friends make fun of you for, that is actually the thing that will make you successful. Because it creates this tension. Because when you're doing something weird, you have to justify to yourself why you're doing it. And it pushes you to think a little bit more about what you're doing.
But this is the second best news I've had all year, which is that my long baths are another good sign. This is fantastic. Well, there's a healthy tension in these events between the cocktails and the questions. And I do want to make sure that we all have time to cocktail, because part of what we want to do with these things is initiate interesting conversations, get people talking around the room, and so in an effort to land this Cessna, I'd love to maybe move to questions from the room. Anybody have any questions for Charles?
Yeah.
Just what you were just saying, I there was a lot of giggles in the background, and I think one of the questions that came up was, is it all the things you do that are beneficial, or is it just the ones that make you think deeper?
So the question was, is it all the lame things that we do that are beneficial, or just the things that make us think deeper? It's the ones that make you think deeper that are the good ones. So, like, if your contemplative device is like, you applying Minesweeper, that might not be the best contemplative device. So here's what we know about the behaviors that tend to push us to think more. They tend to have 2 characteristics. And this again, is like this deliberate practice. Number 1, they tend to be slightly boring and a little tense, right? So think about standing online. So 20 years ago, if you were standing online waiting to see a movie, you would be bored. And so what you might do is you might turn to the person around you and start up a conversation. And like, that's actually kind of like a hard thing to do. It's a little awkward, right? If you look through people's diaries of like these weird connections that people have made, you find that bumping into people on lines is a major theme. Lorne Michaels met Chevy Chase while they were standing on line waiting to see a Monty Python film. Now think about what it's like to stand in line now. I guarantee you, none of you have been bored for more than 15 seconds on a line if you had a smartphone in your pocket. Right? You pulled it out and you tried to alleviate the boredom. So the things that tend to be these quirks that we have that are contemplative devices, they tend to be things that are a little bit boring and a little bit awkward. because that kind of creates this tension that pushes us to think. But there's a second thing, is that the people who take advantage of these contemplative devices, they tend to be people who force some type of data or feedback out of it. So one of the things that separates experts from everyone else is that they look for feedback loops and they force feedback, right? So expert chess players, where there's this huge delay in figuring out if a particular move works. Expert chess players typically ask their opponent to give them feedback on moves after the match. People who have long delayed feedback loops tend to find ways to squeeze information out of it. So what does this mean for you? This means that the practices that you have that are weird, they should not only be kind of weird and you should recognize them as being weird, but you should also be very aware of how other people react to them. Because you're trying to find some type of feedback loop. You're trying to, or you should be interrogating yourself about the fact that like you missed your subway stop because you like started reading this thing and you got so into the idea, and is missing the subway stop worth the idea that you came up with? People who are most productive, they tend to see choices as experiments. And in doing so, they recognize that they're not failures or successes. They're things that generate data, and that any data is pretty good.
Okay, great. Any other questions for Charles?
Stephen, yeah.
Hey, Charles. Might be a little inside baseball, but I think probably people are interested in it given the topic. Can you say anything about your workflow as a writer, your own technique, both in terms of researching and putting the books together? Anything that's applicable from this?
So it is the most miserable experience on the face of the planet. So what I do is I usually so I have this rule, which is that I call people instead of read, because first of all, when you call people, they tend to sort information for you much, much faster than you can sort it on yourself by reading. Like oftentimes I'll call someone up and I'll say, I don't actually know what question to ask you, so can you tell me what question I should ask you first on this topic? And then they usually tell me what I should ask them about, and that's more effective than trying to read papers. It's also super duper awkward to call someone up and basically be like, yeah, I just called you and took up your time. I'm an idiot who doesn't even know what question to ask you. But it's super productive. They end up giving me all this information. And then I try and figure out how to make the chapter work, and I get so stressed out that I bitch and complain to my wife so much that we actually have a rule that I'm not allowed to talk about what I'm working on after 6 o'clock in the evening, because otherwise she would divorce me. And so that's what I usually sit down and I try and come up with like what the idea that I want to write about is. And then I call experts, and my goal is to basically convince them that I'm as dumb as humanly possible, but they should still speak to me. And I ask them questions that confirm for them that I am an idiot, because I'm asking them, I don't even know what question to ask you. And then I get so stressed out about finding the right story to illustrate that idea that I can't sleep, and it just makes me totally sweaty, and then the book is done. So I don't know if that actually answers your question. It's not very practical, but basically the more painful it is, the more I feel like it's working.
Okay, great. Any other questions for Charles? Yeah, Gabby, do you? Oh. Okay, a question from your Facebook fans.
Oh,
Charles.
fantastic.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this user worked at a 100% remote company for 2 years. He wants to know, do you think tech or norms or the nature of work itself will change enough that we'll get to a place where we can be as productive on the go as we are in the office?
So the question for people who couldn't hear is, this is someone who works at a tech company. Will tech progress so that we can be as productive on the go as we are at our desk? I kind of feel like we're already there, right? I don't know that we need to be at a desk for anything. But I think that this gets to the basic question, which is that productivity is not a function of the gadgets you have around you or the technology that's available to you. Certainly the technology is important, right? But they managed to somehow build an entire nation and things like the Panama Canal and go to the moon before we had smartphones, before we could like email each other every night. Most productivity is about responding to the technology around us in ways that we don't allow it to dominate We don't allow it to make us busy, but instead we take control of what we're thinking about and how we're thinking about it. So I think the answer to the question would be, yeah, like technology will continue to make information and knowledge less scarce. You'll be able to answer any question you want to someday. But the people who succeed are not going to, that means the people who succeed are the ones who like figure out the right questions to ask. And the only way that we figure out the right questions to ask is by using the killer app throughout history, which has been thinking and seeing some insight and some question that other people don't realize is even there.
Fantastic. Gabby, another one, or are we good?
Yeah. Is there any activity or pursuit that the science of productivity can't be applied to?
Is there any activity or pursuit that the science of productivity can't be applied to? So let me answer that question kind of circuitously. So I think that there's this basic question, which is, what is productivity, right? There's an economic definition of productivity. But for all of you, that's not really applicable, right? Like when we think about productivity, if I was to ask you what a productive day was, some of you would say Wednesday morning was productive because I dropped my kids off and I got to work and I was able to power through like all these emails that I had to deal with. But Friday morning was productive because I walked my kid to school and I had time to talk to them and I wasn't distracted by what was going on at the office. Productivity at the end of the day simply means that we know what our goal is and we know how to get closer to that goal without without sacrificing everything that's important to us, without the stress and the strife that kind of can make life unpleasant. That doesn't mean the eradication of tension, because tension is important, but it means the eradication of the unpleasantness of tension. And by that definition, I think that there's nothing that you can't apply this insight of productivity to. If productivity is saying, find a way to make yourself ask what is really important to you, and how do you get closer to that without having to have an awful life as a result. Does that make sense?
It makes a huge amount of sense. Well, thank you, Charles. And I think Charles is going to be signing books.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? And hope will be in circulation. We have wine on us, cash bar, the other stuff is wonderful food. We look forward to talking with all of you. We have, next month, we have on May 12th, we have the great Susan Cain, author of Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Won't Stop Talking, not unlike myself and Charles, which will be great. We hope to see a lot of you there. And thank you so much, Charles.
Can I make one request before?
Yeah.
Okay, so let me tell you what my biggest contemplative device is. When you write a book, except for like people writing mean reviews, or when you talk about your book, nobody ever gives you negative feedback. So my email address is charles@charlesduhigg.com. And if you think any of this is like bullshitty, or if you think like any of the stories don't make any sense, or you don't understand what the hell I'm saying, please send me an email and say like, I thought this part was kind of bullshit. And that's my contemplative device. I'd appreciate it.
Failure is just another data point, right? You're living the methodology. That's fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming, everybody.